I'd like to start by telling you something important. Something so important that many people search their entire lives to find it, but they do not succeed. Something many people believe they have found, but they are in fact mistaken. And some things that many people do find and are on a mission to share it with others. I want to tell you the meaning of life. The Dalai Lama once said, "I believe that the very purpose of life is to be happy. From the very core of our being, we desire contentment." Vladimir Putin has said, "The meaning of our whole life and existence is love. It is love for the family, love for the children, and love for the motherland. And this lies at the heart of all of our behaviors." The meaning of life is something that many people wrestle with, and most responses circle around these ideas: happiness, usefulness, experiences, and love. Some of the most popular opinions on the meaning of life can be traced back to major figures in human history: Aristotle, Stephen Hawking, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But I want to be clear, these views are not the meaning of life. The meaning of life is twofold. First, to have a genuine relationship with the Lord your God, and second, to get others to have a genuine relationship with the Lord. And it is from this perspective that I speak to you today. We just listened to a passage about a widow who was in great distress. And she was in distress because her husband had passed away, she had debts to pay, the debt collectors were coming to take away her sons as slaves, and she only had a jar of olive oil to her name. She ran to Elisha, who instructed her to collect as many empty jars as she possibly could from her neighbors, and to use her single jar of olive oil to fill the many jars. So in a step of faith, the widow followed the instructions and was able to fill enough jars to pay off her debts. So naturally, since this is the Science Symposium service spoken by Sam Smidt, I found it necessary to summarize this passage into 3 parts, each starting with the letter S. The first S is seek. In this passage, the widow sought out the prophet Elisha when it appeared that the world was falling down around her. She specifically sought out Elisha because we are told that her husband followed the Lord. The second S is submit. Here, the widow submitted to the instructions of Elisha despite the physical limitations of his instructions. How can one jar of olive oil possibly fill many other jars? The widow exemplified faith and submitted to the powers of the Lord. And the third S is sustain. After her jars were filled, she was able to pay off her debts, keep her sons, and be sustained into the future. So in seeking out the Lord through Elisha, submitting to the glory of the Lord, the widow was ultimately sustained. And this model of seek, submit, sustain is an excellent model for how we are to view the sciences. So let's first look at seek. In this passage, the widow's world was falling down around her. And if you follow the news or keep up with the scientific headlines, it truly feels like our physical world is falling down around us. We hear about how ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, floods are more intense, droughts are more intense. We're basically setting a new air temperature record every month. Vulnerable communities are forced to migrate, and many species are at threat for extinction. And these are just the topics related to climate change. This past week at the Science Symposium, we were lucky enough to host the grandfather of climate science, Dr. Wally Broecker. Dr. Broecker was at one point in his career a Wheaton College student, but he transferred to Columbia University and spent his entire career there. During his career, Dr. Broecker has pioneered work in climate science and geochemistry, and he is credited with publishing the first paper to use the phrase global warming. And he spent his time on campus speaking about the effects of human-induced carbon dioxide emissions, and he was clear to indicate that we will undoubtedly face the consequences of increased CO2 for centuries to come. He mentioned shifting precipitation patterns, the reorganization of wildlife across the globe, and the change in large-scale ocean circulations, all of which are likely to be a reality in the near future. So as a Christian, what does it look like to seek out science when it truly feels like the world is falling down around us? And this is where it starts to get interesting, because as scientists, we feel an obligation to keep the world functioning, to keep it going, to make sure that it does not fail. But as Christians, we already know the end. We know that no matter how hard scientists work to keep the earth functioning in a way best suited for humans, we know that the earth is going to end. So why put in the effort to try to seek something that is sure to fail? And this gets back to the introduction and the meaning of life, which was to first have a relationship with the Lord your God, and second, to get others to have a relationship with the Lord. Psalm 19 tells us, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." And Job chapter 12 says, "But ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind." The Bible tells us very clearly that God reveals himself through nature. And I guarantee that everybody listening in this room has felt this in their heart at some point in life, whether you recognize the call or not. There is an inherent homing quality to nature, and that is your indication that you are a part of something greater. You are a part of God's creation. This intimate quality to nature is often misunderstood, and you see this all the time in social media or in popular culture or even in historical literature. John Muir, a well-recognized naturalist, author, and founder of the Sierra Club, is often quoted with saying, "The mountains are calling, and I must go." This sentence is frequently used to highlight the wonder and the whimsy of travel and the majesty of nature. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody had this quote stickered onto the side of their Nalgene bottle in this room. It's that popular of a quote among those drawn to the outdoors. But I find it interesting that this is only half of the quote. The real sentence is this: "The mountains are calling, and I must go, and I will work on while I can, studying incessantly." Muir was a major activist for the protection of federal lands, and this sentence was not a call for wanderlust, but it was a call for conservation. So why do we only say half of the quote? And it's because there is a wonder to be found in the concept that the mountains are calling. But I have a question for you. If the mountains are calling and you must go, what do you expect to find once you are there? Because it's not the mountains that are calling. It's God calling through his creation. Everyone has had an intimate moment with this creation. Did you listen clearly enough to hear the voice of God? At the Science Symposium, Dr. Broker said that the earth is hiding its secrets, and it's the scientist's role to uncover the earth's mysteries. And I even watched a recent recording of a pastor telling how God hides his secrets in the earth. And you hear about this relationship all the time in the sciences, about how scientists are on a mission to uncover earth's secrets. And this topic is spoken about as if it's this big game of hide and seek, that the scientists are the seekers and the earth is the hider. But here's the problem with this perspective. If the earth is the hider in this game of hide and seek, that means its ultimate goal is to not be found. We as a society have this game backward. The earth is not hiding, it is crying out to be found. It is us who are hiding behind our inactivity, blinded by sin or distraction, or avoiding the effort necessary to pursue a path of scientific challenges. And in doing so, we are allowing the world to fall down around us without any regard to the overall meaning of life. If you have responded to the calling of God through the mountains, the next step is to seek passionately the goal of maintaining nature in a way that allows others to hear the voice of God. The widow sought out Elisha when her world was falling down around her. Now go seek out God in a world that is falling down around you. Now let's look at the second S, and that is to submit. The widow was asked to complete a task that quite frankly sounds impossible. How can one jar of olive oil possibly fill many other jars? So what did she do? She questioned Elisha and asked for a new plan, right? No, she submits to Elisha's plan and is diligent in doing so. How are you submitting to a righteous plan in your life? This is my first year at Wheaton College, but I am extremely proud to know that you all are very passionate about your missions trips. I think it's absolutely wonderful that you put yourself out there to see the world and to seek out God's people who need his love in addition to the resources necessary for living. When I was younger, I was able to take a trip to Brazil and visit the Amazon rainforest. And in doing so, I witnessed children playing in a river, next to those who were bathing, next to those who were going to the bathroom, next to those who were taking a drink. And it's these experiences that many of you have already had that really get you thinking about the world. One piece of advice that I have for students who are looking to be more productive or going on to grad school, and well, how can I succeed in grad school? It's to find the time of day that you're most productive and just totally own it. And if you're lucky, this productive period will fall at a reasonable hour of the day. For example, my most productive time is from 10 to 3. But I should clarify, I'm talking about 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. I am not one of the lucky ones. And as you can imagine, or if you have likely experienced, staying up late to work on projects or studying, it gets you thinking about things kind of in a strange way. And for me, I start to think about others in the world. But particularly, I think about those who are suffering. I think about the people who are thirsty, and those who are dying, and the children who have cancer. And what am I doing about it? I am sitting in my room working. And what are you doing about it? You're sitting in your dorm room, studying, sleeping, hanging out with friends. People are out here in this world suffering, and we're sitting in the comforts of a warm shelter with internet access. And if you go down this path very far, you quickly realize that it's impossible to help everyone in need. And honestly, the truth is that there are people out there who will never get help. So what do we make of this? Do we just give up, knowing that we can never fully succeed? We have to submit to God's almighty plan and trust that the earth and his followers will be redeemed, even those that we cannot reach. In the meantime, in this falling world, we are tasked with the responsibility of doing all that we can to relieve the suffering of others. And I don't just mean the distribution of water filters, the collection of shoes, or the gathering of Christmas toys. While these things are truly great in themselves, there are much more complex problems that need to be addressed. And they require the work of Christian scientists. I'm talking about climate change scale problems. In the United States alone, the EPA estimates that about 55% of all streams and rivers are polluted. And this is in a country with strict environmental regulations. So what about developing countries, the ones without regulations? The United Nations reports that about 90% of wastewater and 70% of industrial waste is returned back into the environment untreated in developing countries. These are the types of challenges that need Christ-centered minds. You are the ones to submit to the scientific challenges that allow others to see the hand of God. You are the ones to use your God-gifted academic abilities and strengths to reach out to those in a way that others simply overlook. My passion for missional science was sparked when I was in Brazil in 6th grade. How about yours? When was your passion sparked? Many of you are at a point in your career where you're deciding what type of path to take beyond Wheaton College. And others of you are just starting your time here at Wheaton, and you're becoming first exposed to the types of opportunities that you can pursue in your life. Either way, I challenge you to let your faith influence your career and not let your career influence your faith. Submit to God's will and your calling to seek out others, and pursue this in your careers. And if you're still looking for a career path that allows you to pour back into God's creation and his people, consider a career in the environmental geosciences. Everyone relies on natural resources, and this is only going to become more relevant as competition increases with a growing population. The environmental geosciences are a gateway to the world. Water, food, energy, everybody needs them, but not everybody has them. If you are providing these things, you can go anywhere. The world is literally yours. And in doing so, you are able to interact with people that others simply don't get an opportunity to communicate with. Forget legal restrictions. If you can bring food, water, energy, you're in. Think about the missional opportunities associated with these places, regulated against outsiders, but you can go because you are an environmental geoscientist. And if you feel that the scientists are not your calling, at minimum, I encourage you to pursue a path towards scientific literacy. The knowledge gained through science is growing exponentially. Be someone who is able to engage in scientific discussion. Be someone who can bring a Christ-centered perspective to the interpretation of scientific discoveries. And be someone who can use the sciences as a way to spread the word of the Lord. And when you feel that things are impossible, look to the widow. God multiplied her resources just as he will multiply your efforts when you submit to his almighty purpose. Lastly, let's look at the third S, and that is to sustain. With only a jar of olive oil to her name, we see the widow walk away with enough money to pay off her debts, keep her sons, and be sustained into the future. So in other words, by following through with Elisha's plan, she was sustained. So how did this happen? How did she go from not having enough to having enough? And the answer is simple. God is enough. The widow had nothing, but she had God, so she had everything. We see the same example elsewhere in the Bible. The feeding of the 5,000, and later the feeding of the 4,000. The miracle here is that God multiplies what we bring to the table. In our own lives, we may only have a jar of olive oil, but if we submit to God's will, He can turn that one jar into more than we ever thought imaginable. And it is because of this sustenance that I challenge you to consider a career in missional sciences. My first thought when thinking about missions is, well, what does that mean for me? Does that mean that I have to give up on being a scientist? Does that mean that I have to give up on living in the country? Does that mean that I have to give up on a career? And I think about the commonly preached idea that I need to give up everything in order to follow God. For many people, this is a hard concept to wrestle with. And if you have ever thought about what it would look like to serve in a different country, and if this is something that is challenging you, then we have to start talking about two different questions. One of those questions is, are you afraid or are you concerned because you're afraid to let go of what you already have? Or are you concerned because you feel like there's a different path for your life, a path that may actually lead to a calling in the professional world? God's calling is different for every person. Romans 12 tells us, we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve, and if it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement, and if it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Maybe your purpose is to pursue a career, but maybe that is so you can invest it back into God's people. And this is something that I've struggled with for many years. As an undergraduate student, I wanted more than anything to bring clean water to people. So I decided to be a geology major because that's something that you can do with a geology major. And I took class after class in the geosciences, but do you know how many classes in a traditional geology track are actually offered that are about water? 1. The major I needed offered 1 semester of technical water training. So what did I do? I picked up an environmental science major. But do you know how many water classes are offered on a traditional environmental science track? 1. And it's the same one that's cross-listed in geology. I was passionate about water, and I spent 4 years following 2 majors to take 1 class on water. I was so frustrated, I thought about switching to education, I thought about switching to medical science, but in the end, I trusted that my path would be sustained by God. And I was extremely anxious and excited to bring water to people, but sometimes a path simply requires patience. In your career, you may not receive instant gratification. And I want to be clear that not everyone is called to be a missionary, but everyone is called to fulfill their purpose with the best of their ability and a love for God's people. I want you to consider a different perspective today. In our passage, the widow had nothing and relied on God for everything. If you are in this room right now, you already have more than nothing. At minimum, you have a world-class education. So maybe instead of envisioning yourself as the one with nothing, think about what it would look like if you were in fact the one with everything. There are people in this world who truly have nothing and are crying out to God for sustenance. What if your purpose is to serve as a pathway to sustenance? What if you became a scientist and developed a water system for a community, complete with a sustainable water source, irrigation for crops, and energy for a future? I can imagine that the person in that community with nothing, who has been suffering and crying out to God for years, would feel that God provided for them in a way that was truly unimaginable. You have been given extraordinary gifts by God. You have been gifted with the financial resources and academic mind that is in the top percentile of your generation. You have been given an educational opportunity that is only available to a very, very small percentage of the world. So I encourage you to rely on God's sustenance. Pursue your calling, and you will be sustained. Here at Wheaton, I am extremely thankful that the water options offered at the college span more than just 1 class. And not only that, Wheaton College has a long history with the geosciences. In fact, it was one of the original core requirements for every student to take here at the college. Wheaton College has a long history with the environmental geosciences, but that's because the college has a clear understanding that geology means resources, and resources mean people. Studying the environmental geosciences at a Christian college is a life-changing experience. And do you want to know why? It's because you can count the number of Christian colleges offering geology on one hand, and you probably would have some digits to spare. Nowhere else in the world but Wheaton College do you get an opportunity to pursue a tailored coursework that is passionate about Christ-centered geoscience. If you want to be a missionary and a scientist, choose Wheaton College. If you want to be a lunar physicist, choose Wheaton College. And if you want to be a botanist, choose Wheaton College. The educational opportunities offered in the environmental geosciences here at the college are unmatched at any other institution. And you will be one of the few who is trained in both earth resources and Christian outreach. So as you go about your time at Wheaton, I encourage you to think about what it would look like to pursue a career that captures your God-granted abilities in order to help sustain God's people. After all, there were neighbors in this passage who had the extra resources available to provide the widow with her many jars. Perhaps you were called to be one of those neighbors. So to conclude, I want to echo the widow one last time. In life and in this falling world, seek out God, submit to his will, and we will be sustained. Thank you.